Immigration and urbanization. In this lecture, I'm going to address Virginia SOL US 2.4b, where I am going to explain the reasons for the increase in immigration, growth of cities, new inventions, and the challenges arising from this expansion. A couple of essential questions you should be able to answer by the conclusion of this lecture are: why did immigration increase? Why did cities grow and develop? What challenges faced Americans as a result of these social and technological changes? As always, you're invited to take notes, not required to, but I encourage it because you are allowed to use the notes on the quick check in class. Life changes greatly after the Civil War. The Second Industrial Revolution brought change and industrial growth. New technologies such as telephone service changed the way people and businesses communicated. Thomas Edison contributed electric lighting and electricity-powered machinery, which spurred the Second Industrial Revolution. Industrialization led to urbanization by moving the demand for labor to the cities. Specialized industries led to increased growth in certain cities, as happened in the steel industry in Pittsburgh. Chicago's growth was fed by the meatpacking industry, and major railroad lines brought beef from the West to be shipped to Eastern consumers. Now, immigration in particular brought many changes. Immigration had push factors and pull factors. One push factor in Europe was widespread crop failure, which left farmers in debt and people starving. The Irish potato famine of the 1840s was one of the most severe crop failures. And this is just one example of something that caused immigrants to come to the United States. Now, in the early, middle period of the 1800s, middle 19th century, maybe 1840s to 1870s, really that group of immigrants mainly came from England, Germany, and Ireland. And those are sometimes referred to today as the old immigrants. And some of it had to do with, again, you had the crop failures in Ireland, but also political persecution, and even religious persecution. In the case of, in Germany, if you were a Catholic, Lutheran Protestants were persecuting Catholics in the German republics in the mid-1800s. Germany itself as a country doesn't yet exist until 1871. So other pull factors that bring immigrants to the United States. You had some people that came to the United States seeking religious and political freedom, and others who hoped for greater economic opportunities. And the abundant and relatively cheap land will lure immigrants to the United States. These were opportunities that weren't available to them in Europe. A lot of that land was already in the possession of usually people descended from nobility going back to the Middle Ages. And a lot of people seeking, again, political freedoms, religious freedoms, and the ability to own land. They came from Southern and Eastern Europe. Whereas the old immigrants came from Northern and Western Europe, the new immigrants, as they became known, came from Southern and Eastern Europe. And they were met with a lot of discrimination in the United States. Just as the old immigrants had at one time faced some discrimination in the 1850s, the new immigrants after the Civil War, who come from Southern and Eastern Europe, are met with discrimination as well. They will have, some of them, different religious beliefs, there are different languages. These will become things that some people will see as a threat And in the cities, they'll actually be seen as a threat to jobs, especially in the 1870s after the Panic of 1873. There'll be a lot of discrimination that the new immigrants will face. But you'll actually see, looking at this map here, that most of the immigrants who came to the United States came from Southern and Eastern Europe in the late 1800s. And a lot of the immigrants who came to the United States on the East Coast came to really one of the main processing areas, which was Ellis Island. The boats would unload here, and they would be processed through they would be given medical exams, and everybody would be checked before they were allowed to come in to the United States. And here you have some of the processing lines within one of the buildings at Ellis Island. Immigrants had very little help coming into this country, and so you had the establishment of what were called settlement houses. And what these settlement houses did was they provide child care for immigrants so that they could work during the day. They also provided classes in teaching them how to adjust to American society, from reading and speaking, to basic expectations in American society. And these settlement houses were really a benefit for immigrants because it was one of the few places where they could get help in a country that was very, very, very different from where they had come from. One of the most famous of which was Hull House, which was run by this woman right here, Jane Addams. Immigrants, though, did, as I said, they found a lot of discrimination when they came in to the United States. The Irish were a major group that faced discrimination. Oftentimes they were stereotyped as being drunks. And then the Chinese on the West Coast, they were seen as a threat to jobs, and because they were so culturally different from many Americans who had lived in the United States before they came, they looked at the Chinese as a threat in general. And in fact, in a lot of the popular literature at the time, Chinese were oftentimes singled out as they were the bad guys in the old westerns that were written in the late 1800s. And this actually led to a number of laws that were passed, including one that was known as the Chinese Exclusion Act, which put a moratorium or a limit, essentially banning immigrants from China for a period of time. Also, immigrants, because they came here with virtually nothing, they lived in tenements and ghettos. Ghettos are neighborhoods. And oftentimes they weren't allowed to live in areas. There would be exclusionary practices where they weren't allowed to live with certain groups of people. So they found comfort in their own culture. And so you'd have an Italian ghetto or Italian neighborhood, an Irish neighborhood. There'd be an African American neighborhood. There'd be a Jewish neighborhood. And a lot of these buildings were substandard. There were no building codes at the time. Some of them were unsafe. They didn't have fire escapes on some of them. Some of them were built right next door to the factory. And you had large families living in single-room apartments. And a lot of times there was no running water. They would have to go outside to use the bathroom. Another thing was there was a lot of corruption in the cities. You had political machines that developed. And this political machines actually took advantage of the fact that immigrants were looking for help by getting immigrants to vote a certain way for particular candidates that would help that group. At the same time, it would help those people who were running for office. One of the most famous political machines was one run by Tammany Hall in Boss Tweed, we actually see here. And we'll talk more about him in class. Graft becomes a problem. Many of these political machines actually took money from the government. They would skim off a little bit. They would falsify accounts and get government money. Basically, find ways of getting taxpayer dollars. Find ways of committing fraud. And there's a lot of corruption. Corruption, as far as bribery was concerned, bribing of cops, bribing of judicial officials, bribing of government officials occurred fairly regularly. And this was going on in the cities at a time when people weren't going to normally stand up to the political machines. They weren't going to stand up to this because, well, one, the political machines were helping them out, which while they were corrupt, the immigrants were getting help. They weren't getting help from anybody else. And another thing is that any criticisms that were made, well, many of the immigrant groups, again, they're going to see it as kind of an attack on them. In summary, population changes, growth of cities, and new inventions produced interaction and often conflict between different cultural groups. Population changes, growth of cities, and new inventions produce problems in urban areas, and that's about it.